Hello, I'm Ken Christensen, and today I'm going to share with you some of the treasures of my library. I'm here in my library, at least part of it. I have about half of my books downstairs and the other half upstairs in the upper level of my house. And unfortunately, I don't have one room big enough to accommodate all. It's always been a lifelong dream, and I'm sure it is of many book collectors, to have a beautiful library and one of those wonderful ladders that slide along and you can climb up and look at books. But I'm very fortunate to have most of my books together. Over the years, I've sold hundreds of books, I've lost others, borrowed library books, etc. But what I have now is, I guess, my more precious books, and the ones that mean the most to me. Now, when I say precious, I don't really mean monetarily valuable. Book lovers know that you establish a relationship with your favorite books, and it can be a beat-up old paperback, but you carry it in your hip pocket when you were traveling, or it could be a hardback that you found obscured, or maybe a gift. So my books, as all libraries do, reflect my personal taste. So I'm going to show you some of the books around my library here and point out a few of my favorites. As you can see, there's books everywhere. This is a favorite poster of mine, which I acquired in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's one of a very limited edition, printed on some beautiful heavyweight printing paper made there in the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe. And I've got a pretty big collection of other posters that are book related, of book festivals and different things like that. But anyway, you see the books on the floor here is my unread pile. And here is more of the unread pile, double stacked. And we'll go around the corner here and I'll show you more. Now, this wall here are my fiction books. And over here in the corner, another unread stacked. So I've got my work cut out for me. So all of these are fiction. And then the other side of the room, which I either call the library or my studio, because this is where I paint here, some of my paintings. But this wall are all nonfiction books. Again, this is, half or perhaps a bit more than half of the books that I own, and the other half are upstairs, and perhaps we'll make our way up there. This little stack on the floor are the ones to read immediately, the ones that I'm planning on reading next. But what happens is I acquire new books. Often they're immediately put into service and I read it starting the very next day or within days of acquiring it. And other books might sit around for months or years until I get around to it. But my rule is I do not buy a single book that I do not intend to read. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of recent acquisitions. Now, where do I get my books? Traditionally, of course, used bookstores. But as time has gone on, now we have online book sales, and it is just too darn easy to get anything you want at a good price and in good condition. I usually use the website abebooks.com, A-B-E, and then, of course, Amazon is the giant. But unfortunately, I find out that Amazon bought AbeBooks, so I guess it doesn't matter too much which site you use. Although I usually use AbeBooks, and I find myself, frequenting it quite often. I don't go into used bookstores as much anymore, which is unfortunate, because when you're browsing, you accidentally come across things, and sometimes that's the best way to find interesting books, or maybe to change your reading habits, or to read something you weren't expecting to read. But the other place I buy a lot of books are thrift stores. And thrift stores are pretty crazy. I'm a thrift store junkie. Either you understand what I'm saying or it sounds abhorrent to you. You're always greeted with a strong smell when you get into the thrift store. And the books are helter-skelter, completely mixed up, sometimes prices all over the map, incredible, bizarre conditions, and then the bulk of it is pure garbage. Let's face it. Something gets tossed out, old textbooks, religious tracts, self-help books, obscure subjects, everything under the sun. So it's a needle in the haystack, but I enjoy it. That's part of the hunt. Anyway, let me show you a couple that I found recently. Here we have a copy of, we have a copy of Northwest by Zadie Smith. Zadie Smith has become one of my favorite authors over the last couple of years. I started with White Teeth, her first and most famous book. And let's see, I also read Swing Time, I was a little disappointed in, and On Beauty, which is my favorite one by her. Now, Northwest, or NW here, is talking about Northwest London. These are the postal codes of London, and this is the area that she grew up. She's talking about that. But let me show you something here. A signed copy. Right. First edition, signed copy, cost 50 cents. So that was a pretty good find. And I just picked this up yesterday, or 2 days ago. Different thrift store, different city. And here we have Race. I think this may have been the last book by Studs Terkel. I've read several others. I think the first one I read was Hard Times, which I like very much. And I've also read, let me think here, Working, which was excellent. And then recently one about jazz music. But anyway, How Blacks and Whites Think and Feel About the American Obsession. And it has some magazine articles that people cut out, some other things that they've saved. And we have a long dedication here from Studs Terkel. And you could ask, like, how do you know it's really that person's autograph? Well, what I do, I research it online, like you can research everything online and compare autographs. But this seems especially endearing because it's inscribed to a friend, Louisa Parrington Tucker. Here is remembering with reverence and delight your father's great work. Grace and Beauty and Understanding, Studs Terkel. So, 50 cents. First edition, signed. Wonderful. Now, being an avid reader, obviously I have my favorite authors. And for me, I was a bit of a loner as a child. And when I talk about favorite authors, I'm really talking about friends, good friends. Being a bit alienated from my community at times and other people and school, etc., I was delighted to find like-minded people in books. They could be people who lived in different countries. And they could be people who lived hundreds of years ago. And yet, when you read their thoughts and it touches something in your heart, there's a connection there. And for me, there was an identification to thinking I'm not alone. And also people who opened up my eyes and confirmed what I believe and expanded upon it. And these people have become friends for life. One of these friends is W.H. Hudson. And unfortunately, Hudson doesn't seem to be very well known now. I usually tell people he's famous for the novel Green Mansions, which was made into a movie starring Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn, I believe. And he grew up in Argentina, but he moved to London when he was about 21. I believe his father was American and his mother was English, but he grew up on the Pampas. And so out of about 25 books, maybe about 7 of them are novels. Short stories, generally set in Argentina, and then his later works, all taking place in England, and generally about bird life. And I was not particularly a birder in the past. I've become somewhat of a birder now, but his descriptions of bird life and nature are just so beautiful and pull you in, and he has a very simple, lucid writing style, and yet there's something very unique about it as well. But going back, I used to frequent a bookstore in Cleveland. Peter Kisagloff was an old Russian man who had a beautiful antiquarian bookstore, and that's where I bought this. This was an edition put out by Dutton, and I have 2 of them. Now, I believe what happened was that at Peter Kisagloff, there were 2 of these, and they were extras, and they even had the full set there. And I didn't have the means to buy it at the time, unfortunately. One of those things that I feel bad about, but nothing you can do about it. But, you know, with a nice book, there's so many elements here. You have a beautiful front piece, the collected works of Hudson. This edition is limited to 750 copies, only 100 for sale in the United States. And you can't really feel the paper there while watching online, but very thick, soft paper, beautifully done. And it's just a pleasure to read a book that's printed on nice paper and very legible. But let me show you a little bit closer up here. So this is my Hudson section here, and then for unable to explain why, but about half of my Hudson collection is upstairs. That we have here A Shepherd's Life, A Crystal Age, A Little Boy Lost, Nature and Downland, Afoot in England, Adventure Among Birds, what's that? Pan, A Crystal Age, Birds in Town and Village. The condition of the books, as you can see, are not great. As a matter of fact, you can see a paint smudge on the one, meaning that I was here in the studio painting, walked over and accidentally bumped into books, which I feel very bad about, but got to kind of get over it. We might go upstairs. Let's go upstairs and see the rest of it. So here are a continuation of my fiction books. By now I'm upstairs in the bedroom. And here is more fiction. Over here are art books. And again, the art books are split. More than half are downstairs. The top two shelves are only books of drawings, classic drawings. Next we have books by the Fauves, the French Fauve painters, my favorites, photo albums and scrapbooks. So here's a continuation of the Hudson books. I think this whole section right there are all W.H. Hudson. And while I'm here, let's drop down. And these two sections together are all Jack London. They came in beautiful covers, the early editions, and it wasn't too much later I discovered that they actually did have dust wrappers in the beginning, and I saw some in a rare bookstore, and they were just plain brown wrappers. But you can see they came with beautiful covers, so when people got these books and they had a plain brown wrapper, they generally just threw away that plain brown wrapper, and it's a bit of a bad joke that now those are more valuable than the books, those wrappers. And here's another one of my best friends, Knut Hamsun. I really love these blue bindings which were put out by Knopf, who was his publisher in the United States. It's been published in different editions. These later ones were published by, who is it, Coward McCann, and also Grosset and Dunlap. Who else do we have here? We have Alexander Dumas, my John Fante collection. Let's move on up here. Here's some Alphonse Daudet, one of my big favorites. Up here, some Yves Babbitt's. Jean Ecart, who wrote Morand de Moore. Richard Brautigan, Charles Bukowski. This has always been one of my treasures, this complete set of Ivan Turgenev, which I bought in Manchester, England when I was 21 years old attending the University of Manchester. There was a used bookseller there, Mr. Morton, who kind of took a liking to me. I was there all the time and I became infatuated with Turgenev, and he took me to his warehouse and I found these books, and they were just one of the greatest treasures of my life. I read all 17 volumes in about the first year or two. And that's been a long time ago, and unfortunately, you know, time passes, your memory fades, so I've started to reread a few. I recently reread Fathers and Children. It's usually called Fathers and Sons, and it was just as good as I remembered. And then The Torrents of Spring is a big favorite, and A Sportsman's Sketches I reread. It was wonderful. And let's see who else we have here. My collection of Henri Murger. He wrote Scènes de la vie de Bohème, on which the opera La Bohème was based. And that was the first book I read in French when I lived in France. And I set about collecting him, and I eventually collected all, I think there's about 16 books by Henri Murger, generally about students in the Latin Quarter. Let's see, anything else special? There's a nice first edition of Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell. some early Henry Melville, a nice little set of Proust in French, some Hunter S. Thompson, of which I have more downstairs. And then, of course, all of these nonfiction books. These are French novels, and on and on. And one more quick shot of another section of books. These are all art books. Here are the books on the coffee table. As it gets through the waiting list, these are at the very top. I just started reading Cross Creek by Marjorie Rawlings because I loved the book The Yearling. It was one of the best books I read in the past year. Arabian Nights. And this is a book recently given to me, American Nations, Colin Woodward. The Onion, never get enough of it. Fairfield Porter. Big Sur Women. 100 Great Archaeological Discoveries. And what do we have over here? Eve Babbitt's An American Character. So, a lot of good things to read. And speaking of my good friends, I got to put Henry Miller right up at the top. The first book I read by Henry Miller was Tropic of Cancer. I think I was about 23, no, a little older than that, more like about 26 years old. I was in Florida, down and out. It's a long story, but very down, very out. And I was staying briefly with an old college friend who lived in an abandoned motel outside his father's bar on one of the keys in Florida. I think it was Grassy Key, perhaps. But anyway, picked up a copy, the same as this black one here in the middle, of Tropic of Cancer, and my mind was blown, for lack of a better expression. I could not believe I had not read Henry Miller before, because he was speaking to my heart. And there's so much to Henry Miller, and he's so misunderstood, considered somewhat of a naughty writer, but a brilliant philosopher. And what gets me about Henry Miller is his brutal honesty. And that honesty is humorous at times. His take on different people and situations is hilarious. So at the one hand, it's philosophic, it's funny, it's bawdy, it's just fantastic. Get a little closer look here. As you can see, I've collected a bit of everything here. I have even editions in French. Small little editions, some signed pieces, paperbacks, one first edition here of the Cosmological Eye, and this wonderful set of Sexus Plexus Nexus, which is the set that I read originally. I think Sexus is his greatest book of all time. And more titles, and more titles. More Henry Miller, more biographies of Henry Miller, commentaries, books by his friends, My Friend Henry Miller by Alfred Perles, Henry and June by Anais Nin. So a big favorite. And now let's see, getting right over here to the side, August Strindberg, another big favorite. Let's see, there's more Strindberg up here. And the first one was The Confession of a Fool. Once again, it was electric reading just the opening pages, and I realized that it was somebody after my own heart. A very bizarre character, Strindberg, who would follow Walt Whitman's dictum of, do I contradict myself? Very well, I do. I contain multitudes, and that was him. Tolstoy, better collections down here, people like Kurt Vonnegut, and then getting down to Colin Wilson, who was a big favorite. And I think my favorite book of his is the Mind Parasites. Fantastic book. It's hard to categorize, science fiction, but it's really philosophy. All of these are Colin Wilson. And some Tom Wolfe. Here we have some Balzac. These are wonderful editions. They're in English, but excellent paper, really luxury editions with beautiful illustrations. I've read about, 20, 25 novels by Balzac. I think when you put the Human Comedy all together, there's something like 76 books. Some are collections of short stories, some are novels. This was part of a set. There's a funny little bookstore up in Point Reyes, Northern California. and they were selling this set one at a time. So they were $10 each, which in a way is a little bit pricey for a used book. But as I say, the paper, the quality of the ink, the illustrations, everything are just fantastic. Now, I read Balzac in French. I lived in France. And out of the 20 or more books that I've read by Balzac, maybe 7, 8 or more I read in French. And it's true, you do get more out of a book in the original language. But it is a little bit easier for me to read in English, and especially when I'm in the United States, you're so surrounded by your own language that it's hard to switch languages when you're in and surrounded by a certain language. So I've enjoyed him in English as much as in French. So we're back over here at the wall of my nonfiction. I don't have such huge particular authors so much in nonfiction, more by subject matter, personal favorites. Here on the top shelf, this is my mostly music, rock and roll, and kind of shifting into what we call alternative culture, alternative lifestyle, things like that. But in other words, Beatles, the Beats, Kerouac, Tim Leary, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, the Kinks, Neil Young, autobiographies, etc. Going into these kind of alternative lifestyle things, mostly like 1960s and Haight-Ashbury. Amazing book, Ringo Livio by Emmett Grogan, who was one of the diggers in the late 60s at Haight-Ashbury. Peter Coyote, who was his best friend at the time, who later became more famous as an actor and narrator, and his version of the same events called Sleeping Where I Fall. Other things, Bill Graham, Live at the Fillmore, different Jerry Rubin, Albert Hoffman, Abbie Hoffman, etc. But moving down here, the third level, let's see, tilt it down a little bit, is my Gurdjieff collection. Now, Mr. Gurdjieff, I consider, how can I put it? Not exactly the most brilliant man that ever lived. It's difficult to pinpoint Mr. Gurdjieff because you could say he's a Russian philosopher, he's a mystic, he's a guru, he was an adventurer, incredible man. He wrote basically 3 books. He wrote All and Everything, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, that's one book, and Meetings with Remarkable Men, and then another one called Life is Only Real When I Am. And that book was somewhat suppressed and not generally read, but I've read them all. This entire shelf are books by and about Gurdjieff. Then getting into some other philosophers, people like Ram Dass, Krishnamurti, Eckhart Tolle, Sai Baba, Meher Baba. I'm open to those other things. Take it with a grain of salt, but I honestly think Mr. Gurdjieff peeled back more layers of the onion of truth than any other thinker I've encountered. And I've read many books by many philosophers, but Mr. Gurdjieff, well, I read one website and it said that Gurdjieff is crack for an intellectual. And you just keep going deeper and deeper, and he is almost unfathomable. But it's such a tickle to the brain to try and grasp it. Let's take a look at some other things here. This little section is my books on books. It sounds like an odd topic, but most quality used bookstores will have a little section on books on books. What does that mean? Well, they're usually books written by editors, written by publishers. Sometimes they're books about book collecting, sometimes memoirs by booksellers. And so that got started when I lived in London and collected books in London, and it was always my dream to own a secondhand bookstore. Eventually I did. I had my own secondhand bookstore in Michigan for about 7 years. Not that big of a store, not that impressive of a stock, but I got to play bookseller for a while. Anyway, while in London, I got fascinated by these, and it all started back in Manchester, the bookstore I was telling you about, when Mr. Morton gave me this book. And it's been a treasure of mine ever since.